Good afternoon. My name is Michael Busani. Today, you're going to be learning more about my Keystone project, which was a memoir of my student teaching experiences from the past year entitled How I Learned to Teach During a Global Pandemic. In March of 2020, the COVID-19 crisis forced us to reevaluate so many facets of our society: public health, social norms, the economy. And among the list of high-profile topics that were discussed on news stations, in group chats, and at dinner tables on a daily basis was the field of education. Were schools going to reopen? Should schools reopen? What would that mean for the kids? What would it mean for the parents? What would it mean for the teachers? And for the first time in my life, it felt like the whole world was watching and paying attention to a field that I watch and I pay attention to on a daily basis. As horrifying as it is to read some of these more jarring headlines about the impact of the pandemic on school systems, it is in some way for me reassuring to know that the concerns of me and my peers have been shared by a vast majority of the population. In April through August of 2020, I could turn on any TV news station on a Tuesday afternoon and hear a high-stakes debate about teachers, which sounds like an alternate reality because when does anyone debate about what to do with teachers other than teachers themselves? I started my student teaching practicum in September 2020. This served as the final piece of my experience as a student in the Wheelock College of Education and Human Development, but also the first piece in my journey as a teacher. I had secured a placement in Newton Public Schools. My placement situation was a little unique in that I would be working with two separate alternative education programs. There was Springboard, a temporary program to support students in transition due to emotional stressors, and Central High School, a more permanent therapeutic learning environment for students facing socio-emotional and behavioral learning challenges. Even though I have informal special education experience working for a theater company for young adults with disabilities, I had never considered immersing myself in this area. It was definitely uncharted territory for me, but I was happy to explore it. Since my academic background is in English education, I would be placed with two English teachers, one with Springboard, one with Central, so I wasn't entirely engulfed by this realm of unfamiliarity. I could continue now and tell you more about my experiences and how life-changing they were. I could tell you about how I found a sense of community in not one but two places in the midst of a time where community was an ancient relic from a world pre-social distancing and face masks. I could do all of this, but if there's anything that I have learned as a teacher, and for the next 10 minutes, you guys are all my students, so welcome to class. So, in order to have us all thoroughly engage with content, I've prepared 4 individual selections from my memoir, all of which share a particular story about my experiences. Here's how this is going to work. I'm going to ask someone in the chat to pick a number 1 through 4. Each number is going to correspond to a different passage. I'm then going to read that passage aloud with all of you, the class. No need to take notes today, guys, but I urge you to listen and think of questions as I read. We will then have a discussion. I would love to hear any thoughts or inquiries that you may have about my experiences or even experiences of your own. I'm happy to respond to anything. The discussion today will not be graded, and participation is not mandatory, but it's highly encouraged. Can I get a thumbs up in the chat if this makes sense? I'm going to wait, guys. There we go. Thank you, guys. Okay. So I need now from anyone in the chat who's just participating or not participating, just please give me a number 1 through 4. 3. Okay, great. I am seeing 3. So this is from a chapter entitled Reading Aloud, Part 2. Full disclosure, I am a Shakespeare nerd. When Kayla asked me to teach Macbeth, I was ecstatic. All except one student had never read any Shakespeare before, so I was amped up to be at the forefront of their first experience with one of the greatest authors of all time. I performed Shakespeare in high school. Edmund in King Lear was my breakout role. Saw countless productions of Shakespeare in the Park in New York. Annalee Ashford as Helena in A Midsummer Night's Dream was very memorable. And took several Shakespeare courses at BU under former president of the Shakespeare Association of America, William Carroll. I knew that my level of passion would surely not be matched by any of these students, and I would be surprised if any of them left the unit dying to go seek out any local productions of Titus Andronicus. But I could challenge my knowledge and fervor to spark a sincere interest in the material. If I could do this, I would consider the experience a success. My lesson on iambic pentameter served as a solid introduction how to read Shakespeare. We talked about rhythm, we broke down how to read couplets, and students even wrote some examples of their own. I would have to wait until the following day to see whether or not this information was actually retained. When we started reading the play, I assigned roles to both virtual and in-person students. After directing some virtual theater productions over the summer, I was very familiar with how unkind Zoom was to the art form. Granted, the goal here was not to put on a flawless reading of Macbeth. Either way, audio delays, unexpected freezes, and the general lack of human connection certainly complicated even reading the text on a purely academic basis. To further complicate this issue, the virtual students would have their microphones off and need to be reminded when it was their turn to read. Meanwhile, the in-person students would have to be cautious of the volume of their computers and voices to prevent audio feedback, making it harder for the students at home to hear clearly. For the first week or so, I was so preoccupied by all of these technical issues that I could barely focus on how the students were actually reading. I still tried to make sure to consistently reaffirm students' reading abilities with a simple nice or thank you for reading that. Small acts of positive reinforcement like these really helped instill some confidence in the more shy readers. About halfway through the unit, we reached a point where I didn't have to assign every role at the beginning of a scene. To my surprise, some students actually were willingly volunteering themselves to read. One student even admitted it helped him pay attention and make sure he was following along. Clearly, my goal of getting the kids comfortable with reading Shakespeare out loud had been accomplished. However, I cannot take full credit for that. The students actively engaged with the text. They participated in class, they asked questions, they made real-world connections to a play written over 500 years ago. True, they hadn't become overnight Shakespeare buffs, but they at least came to class ready and open-minded about diving into complex and unfamiliar material. It wasn't easy for me, and it wasn't easy for them, but together we read aloud the entire play. I am fully aware that they may never pick up another Shakespeare play in their entire lives, but at the very least, I hope they can look fondly on their experience reading Macbeth. So that was the passage for today's class, and now that we've all read that, I'm going to open this up for discussion. So these can be questions for me. These can be experiences you relate to, but also if you have an experience that I haven't had that you think might be interesting to throw into the conversation as a student, as a parent, not necessarily as a teacher, feel free to just put that in the chat, and I'm happy to engage with anything.